Okay, so let us start the discussion. Okay, so I know we have already discussed this in the financial modeling topic. So in business analytics, so this is still being discussed. So when you say analytical tools, so these are the tools that we need to analyze the data. Okay, so it is one way of summarizing the data and presenting it in a very organized manner. So we start with the linear regression. So I know you are already familiar with the linear regression. So the linear regression measures the extent to which an effect has historically been the result of a specific cause. So it's actually trying to understand the relationship of this variable to the other variable. So usually, uh, the other variable is called the independent variable, while the effect or the result of the independent variable is what we call the dependent variable. So in the visualization also, so kanang independent variable is what we call the x-axis, and then um, in the dependent variable, so we call that the dependent the y-axis. Okay. However, the exception is in the ng mga economics ng mga uh, model such as the law of demand and supply. Okay, so as we know, the price is naa sa y-axis while the quantity demand is naa sa um, naa sa x-axis. But in reality, the the real dependent variable is the quantity demand, not the price. Okay? So that's why sa economics mo na exception nato sa uh, linear regression. Okay? O sa pag-show sa sa graph. Okay? So if the relationship between the cause and effect is sufficiently strong, okay, regression analysis using historical data can be used to make decisions and predictions. So dili enough lang that the findings of our studies are correlated. Okay, so correlation again does not mean cause and effect, okay, or causation. Okay, so you have to establish a link first between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Okay, so what are examples of correlation nga posible walay link or we could not explain the link between the two. Okay, so an example would be perhaps let's say most of the time nga mukanta ka, okay? O most of the time nga mukanta ka, mag-ulan. Okay? So I said most of the time because there are times pero gamay ra nga time nga dili mag-ulan every time you sing. Yes, there's a correlation kana kay namatikdan nimo nga something happens when you sing. However, you could not establish a link between the two, okay? The two events. Okay? So even though there is a high correlation between the two, dili na nimo pwede gamiton as a predictor or the cause of the dependent variable or it is the cause of the dependent variable. So what you need to do first is to establish a link between the two variables. And one way of establishing that is using the linear regression. Okay? So if the relationship between the cause and effect or the independent variable and the dependent variable are strong, okay? So there is a relationship between the two, okay? So whatever happens to the correlation, okay? So if ever there high ang correlation, then you can use that independent variable to explain the dependent variable. Okay, so you can use that as a forecast. So an example of a high correlation that perhaps we can explain the cause and effect probably is the spending of advertising. Okay, so there's based on the previous study, so taas ang correlation that every time we spend on advertising, it will result into increased sales. Okay, so there's a high correlation, and we can also establish a link between the two. So we know that every time you spend on advertising, it promotes your products and services. Thereby, it causes the sales to increase. Okay? So we can use the correlation results only if there is an established link between the two variables. So dili pwede nga taas ang correlation but there is no link between the two variables. So time series analysis. So usually in the time series analysis, the independent variable used is the time. Okay? So the variable may be a sales revenue for a segment of the organization, okay, production volume for a plant, expenses in one expense classification, or anything factoring the enrollment stat or the enrollment statistics. Okay, so based on the past data, mas taas ang enrollment sa summer as I mean sa first semester, tapos magkagamay sa second semester, and then obviously sa summer gamay ray mag-enroll. Or if years ang atong analysis, so we can establish that over time, so there's a constant number of enrollees. Okay? So ang increase ana probably nara sa 5 to 10% every year. There are also times that it will also decrease by 5 to 10%. So time series analysis is used for descriptive modeling. So when we say descriptive modeling, so we only use this to describe something or to explain something, but we do not use this for forecasting or predicting. So the time series analysis demonstrates a trend pattern. Okay, so there are I think four patterns. So when we establish a or when we do the time series analysis, so the four patterns could be a trend pattern, a seasonal pattern, a cyclical pattern, or an irregular pattern. So we will explain this one by one. So the information gained from a time series analysis can be used for decision making and policy determination. Another would be the time series forecasting. So kaning time series forecasting, so mo ang gamiton to predict. So it involves using the information from a time series to forecast the future values of that series. So katong time series analysis, it is only used to describe or to explain something, while in the time series forecasting, after the analysis, then you can already establish a cause and effect. Okay? So kay naka-establish na ka cause and effect, okay? So you can use that as to forecast variable. So let's say you have established a link between advertising and sales. So you also predicted that every time you increase your advertising, you will also increase your sales. Okay, so the time series have four patterns. So we have trend, cyclical, seasonal, and irregular. So a trend pattern is performed with a simple linear regression. So it forecasts values using the historical information or data from the past. So for example, you are uh, using the sales or the income for the past 5 years. So those are your historical information. So the regression line is called a trend when the regression is being performed on a time series. So 'di ba I requested you uh to download mga annual reports, okay? And then look at their sales. Okay? So we're trying to look at the pattern. So reminding again the equation for the linear regression. So kaning equation is also used to compute the high-low method and the even the least squares method. So a y hat or the predicted value or the forecasted value is equals to is equal to the fixed or the a. So it's the constant coefficient. So regardless of the year, okay, so naagi na siya nga amount plus b or the slope, or this is also known as the variable coefficient. So this is the variable that changes over time. And x is the independent variable. So that the value of x on the x-axis that corresponds to the predicted value of y on the regression line. So let's say advertising expense. Okay. So y is the dependent variable here. So let's have a pattern. So so if you use this data, so from let's say this is okay from let's say 2010 to 2019. So this is an example of a trend pattern in the time series. So as you can see sa sales niya, it is increasing. Okay, so increasing over time. However, there are also data that mo decrease, sometimes mo increase, mo decrease. But overall, so from 2010 to 2019, so nag-increase ang iyang sales. Okay, so this is the graph for a trend pattern. So kanang green mo na siya ang actual sales. Okay, so there are times nga nitaas siya, maubos na pod. However, if you put a regression line, so kanang broken line dira, so if you have computed the regression line using the formula given, so it shows a straight line nga pataas. Okay, okay, so that's the regression line. So if you can come up with the regression line, you can do some predictions. So pwede na nimo siya gamiton to predict. So let's say you are predicting the data in 2020 or 2021 perhaps. But of course, the projection is based on the historical information. So the circumstances in the past may be different in the future. So as we know in 2020, so we cannot use the trend pattern for the last 10 years kay naay additional information in 2020, which is the pandemic. So perhaps your sales projection on that year will be wrong. Okay, so that's one of the disadvantage of the linear regression. So because it is based on the past data, so we cannot guarantee that what we have forecasted or predicted will be accurate. So so the regression equation, so y hat or the dependent variable, so we found out the constant coefficient nga naa sa 2,273,636 plus the variable coefficient multiplied by x. X refers to time. So when you start at 2010, so the x is 0. Um, the next year would be 1. If you're trying to predict the data in 2000, let's say 14, so i-multiply nimo ang 92,636 by 4 and then add the constant coefficient. So your sales variable or the dependent variable in 2014 would be 2,644,180. In 2017, so you just replace x with 7, then you will have a result of 2,922,088. So the data may be uh, not the same with the actual sales. However, the result would be dili na kalayo ang figures. Another pattern in the linear regression is what we call the cyclical. So any recurring fluctuation that lasts longer than 1 year is attributable to the cyclical component of the time series. A cyclical component in sales data is usually due to the cyclical nature of the economy. So there are businesses nga nakadepende sa um, economic situation of the country. So in a booming situation, these businesses will thrive while during the recession or depression, this business will not or will result into poor performance. So businesses such as mga casinos or mga uh, businesses that are selling mga luxury items. Okay, so unsaon na to pag detect if there's a cyclical pattern. Okay, so these are the data. So so imo ni nakuha nga mga sales figures in their financial statements. So years from 2010 to 2019. So these are the sales figures. So let us see unsay itsura sa cyclical pattern. So as you can see sa cyclical pattern, so grabe ka dako ang iyang kuan, ups and downs. Okay. So as you can see, it's very irregular. The shape is very irregular. So it does not anymore look similar to the regression line. Unlike in the trend, okay, so let's go back to the trend. So there are only small years nga ni deviate or wala kayo siya ni tukma sa regression line. But most of the data points are the same with the regression. The cyclical pattern, so most of the data here are not do not coincide with the regression line. Okay, so unlike in the trend pattern, so mas makakuha kag accurate nga results when you do the regression if the pattern is trend rather rather than in the cyclical. So usually trend and cyclical components of a time series are tracked as annual historical movements over several years. However, a time series can fluctuate within a year due to the seasonality in the business. Okay. Sometimes even within the year na ay fluctuation ang business. So let's say a halo-halo business. So there are months nga taas siya, there are also months nga ubos siya because of the kuan, due to the climate season. So in months that are hot, so there's a less demand for halo-halo, while in the months that are ano, in the months that are hot, so there are a high demand for halo-halo, while in the months that are cold, okay, or rainy season, so there's a less demand for halo-halo. So it shows a cyclical pattern within the year. So another example would be a surfboard manufacturer. So it is highest during the summer months, while during snow, um, the skis would experience its peak sales during winter time. So variability in a time series due to seasonal influence is called a seasonal component. So if the cause of the fluctuation is due to season, then we can we experience a seasonal pattern in a time series. So this is an example of a seasonal pattern. So as you can see, there are months nga taas siya, there are also months nga medyo ubos. So what does a seasonal pattern look like in a time series? So the green line, as you can see, so grabe ka taas ang fluctuation. So grabe ang taas, then grabe po ang ubos. So it looks like a four mountains or four volcanoes. So as you can see, the seasonal pattern is more difficult than cyclical and trend. So even though we can come up with the regression line or the equation, we cannot we cannot be dependent on the forecasting using the regression line. Okay, very layo kayo siya sa shape sa ato ang regression line. The last pattern is called the irregular pattern. So a time series may vary randomly, not repeating itself in any regular pattern. So such a pattern is called an irregular pattern. So caused by short-term, non-recurring factors, and its impact on the time series cannot be predicted. So ang iyang pattern or ang iyang shape dili gid siya magporma, okay? So example of an irregular pattern, so from years 2010 to 2019, so sales figures. So what does an irregular pattern look like in a graph? Okay. So obviously, during irregular pattern, we cannot use the regression. Obviously, the regression uh, will not result into an accurate prediction or forecast of the sales because we could not explain why there's an up and down in the sales. It is not due to season. It is not due to a cycle of the economy. So you cannot really explain because there is no sense in the figures. So if you can see that your sales are the pattern of your sales are irregular, so we cannot use the linear regression. as a predictor. So most likely, um, those variables that have a trend pattern, so mo na siya kuan, pinakagamit ang regression line or linear regression analysis for predicting values. Okay, so again, we discussed about one of the analytical tools, which is the linear regression. So the linear regression is understanding the relationship between the two variables. So again, if there's a strong relationship between the two variables, then the result of any correlation would be useful in the prediction. So time series analysis is a descriptive. So it only describes a pattern or explains something, but it does not automatically used as a predictive. So the time series forecasting, the linear regression is very useful if the pattern is a trend. So there are four patterns: the trend, cyclical, seasonal, and irregular. So this is the formula. So the graph of a trend pattern. So as you can see, it is almost similar to the regression line with a minor deviation or difference. Cyclical pattern. So even though you can come up with a regression line, still if the pattern is cyclical, you cannot use it as it's as a predictor. So the regression line cannot be used as a predictor. Same with the seasonal pattern. And obviously, sa irregular, you cannot come up with a regression. Okay, so I'm done. Do you have some clarifications or questions?